Hello and welcome to this recording about companies' finance. So this lecture, as you've probably guessed, is all about how companies raise the funds they need to go on with their work, to create the working capital that they need in their business, to go about their daily activities. Well, one key way they do that is by issuing share capital. Now, it's share capital that allows individuals to own an interest in a business. If you have shares in a company, you are an owner of that business. Now, for the purposes of your exam, you need to understand the key characteristics of the different types of shares. And there's basically three types of shares you need to think about. The main two are preference shares and ordinary shares that we can see down in the table. The other one that we will mention from time to time is something called redeemable shares. Now, these are shares that are issued on the terms that they can be brought back by the company. So it's almost like a contract, if you like, to buy the shares back, and that's written into the Articles of Association. Now, it might say at what date or what event will trigger the share buyback, and it quite often specifies either a price or a pricing mechanism in order to determine at what price the company will buy back these shares. Now, if a company wants to issue redeemable shares, it's able to do that, but it must make sure that it also has at least one share that isn't a redeemable share, so that once those redeemable shares have been bought back, there will still be somebody who owns the company. And we'll look at redeemable shares later on in a little bit more detail. But the main shares that you need to think about are prefs and ordinary shares. So a preference share is a little bit like a hybrid between a share and a loan, because a preference shareholder usually has a fixed rate of return. So in the example I've given here, we might have a 5% preference share. That means that if it's a £1 share, we would pay them 5p dividend on their investment. If you have an ordinary share, you don't have any such fixed rate of return. An ordinary share will receive a dividend according to the company's profits. So an ordinary share is sometimes called an equity share. And an ordinary share, generally, its fortunes will rise or fall with the success of the company. A preference share, slightly less so. Now, the key difference between preference and ordinary shares has to be this preferential dividend. Now, be really careful with this. If you have a preference share, it doesn't mean that you can force the company to pay you a dividend. It doesn't mean that you're guaranteed to receive a dividend. It just means that if the company decides to pay a dividend, you have a preferential right to receive that. So your preference dividend, in this example of 5p, will be paid before the ordinary shareholders get an equity dividend, hence a preferential right. If the directors of the company decide not to declare a dividend, either because the company has insufficient distributable reserves, or perhaps because the directors want to reinvest that money to grow the company for the future, then the preference shareholder cannot force the dividend. However, preference dividends are usually cumulative, and that means that that preference dividend will be rolled up if it isn't paid. So let's imagine in year one, our company doesn't make enough money to pay its dividend. In year two, it makes more money, but the directors decide to reinvest it, and again, no dividend is declared. In year three, the directors want to pay a dividend, and that they want to pay a dividend to their ordinary shareholders as well as their preference shareholders. But because the preference dividend is cumulative, those preference shareholders are now entitled to receive 15p. So that backlog of 15p, 5p for each year, has to be cleared before the ordinary shareholders can receive any sort of dividend. So you can see that a preference shareholder is in a slightly better position than an ordinary shareholder. Now, the counterbalance to that is that a preference share is normally limited to this fixed rate of return. You don't normally get any more, even if the company has an absolutely stonking year. So for instance, if the company does really, really well, you might find that the ordinary shareholders in that year receive a massive dividend, but the preference shareholders will be stuck with their 5p per year. Unless, that is, the dividend is expressed to be participating. Now, that's not a default position. That's something that has to be written into the company's articles. And if it does, it means that the preference shareholder not only gets his cumulative preference dividend, but he also gets to participate in the extra profits that the company makes. Now, there is an extra point there, but we'll just ignore that for now about liquidation, and we'll look at that when we look at insolvency later. Now, when we're looking at the rights attaching to preference shares, you have to be a little bit careful, because the examiner likes to test to make sure that you understand what the Companies Act position is for preference shares, but what is more likely to be the case in practice. And voting rights are a key point here, because the Companies Act says by default that preference shares and voting share and ordinary shares are both voting shares. They both have an equal right to vote. However, in practice, the voting right is virtually always disapplied for preference shares. So again, read the question carefully if that question comes up. Preemption rights is something we're going to look at in a moment, but again, they apply to ordinary shareholders but not to preference shareholders. A right to share in capital on a winding up. In the normal course of events, if a company is wound up, all the creditors will be paid off, all the company's debts will be paid, and any money that's left over will be distributed between the shareholders. Now, that means that the shareholders will first of all get their capital back, so if they've invested the shares at £1 nominal value, they'll get their £1 back. And then if there's any more money left over, they'll get to share in that surplus profits. Now, again, the Companies Act position says that preference shares and ordinary shares rank equally here. However, the articles, again, will almost always change that. And the articles will say that preference shareholders, having a preference, will also have a preferential right to be repaid capital. So they'll get their £1 back before the ordinary shareholders do. But if they have that right, then usually they will lose the right to share in surplus profits. So they gain something in that they get paid first, but they lose something because if there is extra money, the preference shareholders won't get it. There's one more right mentioned there, which is the right to participate in a rights issue. We'll look at that in a moment, but basically preference shareholders don't have this, ordinary shareholders do. Now, for the rest of this lecture, we're just going to look at some provisions to do with share capital. So just a list of points really that you need to learn. So first of all, class rights. We've mentioned in the last lecture that shares can be issued in different classes. For instance, preference shares, ordinary shares, or A-class shares, B-class shares. Now, if the company wants to change the rights attaching to any one class of share, it's fine for them to do that. And the Companies Act sets out the appropriate procedure. And that says that you can change the rights attaching to a class of share if you have the approval of at least 75% of the shareholders of that class. So a special resolution. And you must give notice within 1 month. That's an unusual date for notice periods to the company registrar. So you might need to learn that one. But you must give notice within 1 month to the company registrar. Now, that's okay because if 75% of the shareholders agree, it might seem reasonable to change the class rights. However, if you have only 24% of the shares in that class, you might want to object to the rights being changed because, it might affect you quite adversely. However, you don't have enough to block that special resolution. Well, there's special legislation that says if you have at least 15% of the shares of the class, and obviously you didn't vote for the variation, then you can apply to the court to have this variation cancelled. You've got 21 days to do so. Now, the court can either confirm that variation or they can strike it out as unfair. What they can't do is play with it. Say, well, if we just change that number there, it's okay. They can't do that. It's all or nothing. Now, the thing is, there are certain situations where you might feel quite aggrieved as a shareholder. You might feel that value of your shares has been reduced. However, the court has looked at a number of circumstances and have said that they will only regard something as a variation of class rights if that rights attaching to that particular share have been changed. And let me give you some examples to show you how that might happen. Imagine that a company has two classes of shares. Let's say it has A shares and B shares. And it has 100 A shares in issue and 100 B shares in issue. And they all have 1 vote per share. Imagine that the company directors decide it would be a good idea to change the rights attaching to the A shares. So they decide that what they'll do is they will subdivide these A shares. So instead of having 100 £1 shares, we will now have 200 50p shares. Now that means that in any vote to do with this company, the A shareholders have doubled their votes. They've now got 200 votes, whereas the B shareholders have still only got 100 votes. Therefore, in any need to pass an ordinary resolution, for instance, the A shareholders will be able to do that, whereas before they couldn't. The B shareholders might feel quite aggrieved here because they do seem to have lost out, don't they? They've lost some power to make decisions on behalf of the company. However, when that case was taken to the courts said, well, as a B shareholder, the rights attaching to your shares have not changed. You still have 100 B shares and you still have 100 votes. Therefore, you can't complain about a class variation because the rights attaching to your share class have not been varied. And that's pretty much what happened in the Greenwich v. Ardern cinema, where one class of shares was subdivided to give it a lot of extra votes, and the shareholders of the remaining classes objected, but the courts did not give them any relief because the owners of that second class of shares hadn't had their share rights changed in any way. In another case, a company issued preference shares which ranked ahead of the ordinary shares. So you can imagine the ordinary shareholders, they've waited and waited for the company to become profitable, they've waited for a dividend to be paid, and then finally, just as they think they're there, the company issues preference shares. So as soon as that company has distributable reserves, it has to pay the preference shareholder dividend rather than the ordinary shareholders. Now, if you're an ordinary shareholder, you would argue that the value of your shares has been reduced as a result of these preference shares being issued. And you'd probably be right. However, you will get no help from the courts under the variation of class right rules because your shares are still exactly the same. You still own the same ordinary shares as you had before with exactly the same rights. Okay, so to be able to bring an action, you must show that it is indeed the rights attaching to your shareholding which have been varied. Now, here we have a quick question. Let's see how well you are listening. Pause the recording and have a go at this and see how you do. Okay, and there you go. So, which shares carry a statutory right of preemption in the absence of an express provision is ordinary shares only. Preference shares don't get that. Carries a right to a dividend at a specified rate. Well, that has to be a preference share. An ordinary share doesn't get that. Carries an automatic right to have capital repaid in the event of a company being wound up. That's both shares. And carries a right to vote in the absence of an express provision. Again, both shares. And you can see what I mean there about reading the question carefully, because if that had asked you in which case is using the provisions commonly applied in company law, then you might find that it would have been correct to exclude preference shares there. Okay, so I think we'll end this topic here, and then in the next lecture we'll look at the rules concerning the issue of shares. And you'll see there's quite a few things to take into account there.